Hello, I am Julie Isaacson, and it is my pleasure to be representing Highland Park Poetry, and an even greater pleasure to be interviewing one of our newer poets to join us, Catherine Hayden. We have a lot to say about Catherine. I only recently met Catherine really in October in a writing class, and at that time I'm happy to say she became my partner in rhyme. And here we are interviewing her. Her first book, What Did the Birds Say to the Moon, was her first anthology of her poetry. The book that is getting a tremendous amount of buzz now, and what we're going to be spending most of our time talking today, is Unsalted Blue Sunrise. And these are poems that she has just recently put together about our wonderful Lake Michigan. And it's really a beautiful and powerful anthology. Catherine is also the founder of Sparkativity, where she trains teachers and business teams in promoting creativity. So we are going to hear a lot about her creative process today. So welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for hosting this
My
wonderful
total pleasure. Before we get into some of the poetry and your process in writing and all that, I wanted to ask you a question because I'm aware that you recently had the opportunity to speak at Indian Trail School, and I wanted to hear how that started and how it went and
Well,
the
you'll have to
reaction.
learn a little bit about the book with my answer, because the cover of the book is a beautiful piece of art. It is oil, pastel, and ink. And this art was done by actually a second grader at Indian Trail Elementary School. Her dad is a graphic designer and somewhat of an art director, and enlisted her in designing the cover. So her class invited me in to come and speak, and then the other second grade classes wanted to come. So we had 80 children, 88 or so year olds, right? 7 or 8 year olds, they're probably 8 by now, 8 or 9, in the gym the week before summer, the hour before recess, with no air conditioning on the first hot day of summer, and it went beautifully.
I'm envisioning them captivated in spite of all
In
those
spite of all
pitfalls.
that, they were wonderful. The teachers were wonderful, and the girl Lily, who designed this cover, who did the art, her dad Russell designed the cover graphically, but she did the art, and she was able to talk about her art process. We read some poems from the book, and the most wonderful part was hearing the students' reactions from their imaginations to the poems that I read aloud. They were outstanding.
As a teacher myself and having shared poetry with young children, to see them, and then it motivates them to write poetry, that's a very, very rich and lifelong experience for them. It's great.
It really was. I think it was for them, and for me. I just loved it. I used to teach second grade a long time ago, so I loved being back with those second graders.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Now we have another appreciation for the book. So you describe the inspiration that you felt in writing this book from a series of photographs that was captured by a friend of your aunt. Was there a specific moment or image that you saw in those photographs that really spoke to you and said, I'm going to do this in poetry?
Yes, there actually was. This was a little book of photographs that she took out of her window, maybe not every day, but all throughout the year. I think she lives on Lakeshore Drive, so she can see a really interesting view of the lake. And there were 2 photos side by side. One looked truly like Siberia. It had ice chunks. I mean, it looked like the Arctic. And then the other one looked like the Caribbean, and it was probably taken around the same time of year. And I thought, I just can't believe it. I had recently moved back to Chicago. I hadn't spent a lot of time looking at the lake recently. And I thought, really, the lake can look like Siberia one day and the Caribbean another day. And I thought, I think I'd like to really do a deep look and go to the lake every day or almost every day and write poems about it.
capture all those different moods. Well,
Yeah.
you do a beautiful job. In writing these poems, was there, I know that you did this through the course of a year in all our forms of weather in 4 seasons. Was there a favorite season?
I don't know if
To
you'll
write.
be surprised about this, but winter. I enjoy winter in Chicago. I lived in California for 10 years and I missed winter. But there is something about winter and writing. Maybe you find this as a writer, that it just, something about the cold and the gray elicits maybe our own need to write about something different. And so I think the winter was very inspiring to me. And probably I wrote many of the poems. I wrote them over the course of a year, of an entire year. So they probably aren't concentrated too much in the winter, but I was very inspired by the winter in many different ways. So, but there's a lot in Chicago weather about preparing for winter.
The
Then
extremes,
winter,
right?
then kind of spring is sort of half winter. So maybe there's just a lot of winter.
Well, I just envision you with frozen fingers wrapped around a pencil,
It's true.
getting your words out.
It happened.
So while you don't use titles for your poems, in your mind, how do you identify, like when you're thinking about a poem that you want to go back and edit or how you want to represent, how do you hold that in your mind
Well,
without the use of titles?
in the first iterations of the manuscript, I had titled the poems by number in order of when I wrote them. It was just 1, 2, 3, but I wrote out the numbers, so I spelled them out. And that was interesting. But as I got to actually laying out the book, it didn't feel like the order was right because the different poems, you know, there were different topics. It just didn't feel like the right sequence to just go in order. That's how I thought it would go. But in the end, it didn't feel right that way. And so when I mixed them up, it didn't seem to make sense to have 1, 2, 3, 4 again. And I started to read a number of sort of historic or famous poets that don't title their poems. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. I could not title the poem. So from that standpoint, I think about it from the first line, the way that in the table of contents is. So they're just listed by first lines. And that's how I think of them.
That's wonderful. I had failed to mention earlier that on June 10th, Catherine will be presenting at Highland Park Poetry at Osmond Home on Sheridan Road, and we'll give the information for that later. So I'm going to let her be the one to read some of her poems, but I did have a few from your book that I wanted to ask you a little bit about, if that's okay. So early in the book, page 3, I want to ask you about this. The poem is "The gentle coming and going waves crooned in my ears this morning, crescendo and diminuendo, like billowy smoke, yawn in these early hours. Coral morning light lingers above the horizon, thoughts stretch across time. I'm loath to return to ones and zeros, to zeros and never the one." This was beautiful, and it struck me as very mathematical in addition to lyrical. And I was very curious about the last lines, that you were loath to return to ones and zeros and never the one. What that represents to you.
Well, one of the things that I found about visiting the lake and really looking at the lake, that when usually I had come from my computer. So I had come from this very narrow experience where I'm squished, you know, at my keyboard, and my entire vision is this screen, right? And I'm probably writing or doing some email or creating a presentation, something like that. And I found that when I would get out, not just take a walk, but actually get to the lake, this expanse of the lake would literally expand my own peripheral vision. And I had taken a self-defense class actually earlier this year that confirmed this idea. The self-defense teacher said that when you're sitting with a phone like this, your peripheral vision contracts, and we did some exercises that proved this. And if you're in a sort of place that you might be a target, it's important not to do that because you can't see out of the corners of your eyes. Well, I think that's true just with the computer or with anything we're focused on. So to go to the lake and have my entire sort of mentality widened was so inspiring. And I think that's where that ones and zeros comes from, because ones and zeros are, you know, like computer language, computer code. So it's kind of getting away from that into the widening.
I've read about studies that even if you're on a speakerphone while you're driving, that even that being on speaker cuts your peripheral vision. It's interesting.
Interesting.
Huh. I wanted to ask you about the poem where you, on page 7, after Federico Garcia Lorca, how your images in this connect to his poem.
Well, his poem, so I should say that my college degree was in Latin American and Spanish poetry and literature. And I did read Lorca in college and really have a heart for, he's Spanish, but the Latin American and Spanish poets. And I think this is his poem, Pequeño Poema Infinito, actually starts with "to take the wrong turn" or "to take a wrong turn." So it's kind of a riff off of that. I don't think it relates to it too much except that first line, and it has a very sort of mystical, kind of dream-like progression, I should say. And I think a few elements in the poem are maybe a little bit similar to the way he wrote it.
Interesting. I just always like to see what the inspiration is, so that helps. So our friend and colleague Jen Meyer did a beautiful review of your book, which is on the Highland Park Facebook page post. And one of the poems that she described is the one that's on page 11, "A gull feather lands at the foot of the bridge of the birch." I loved all of the, if you could just describe what your senses must have felt like writing this, because I feel like you've pulled in all the senses and then in the end jammed in a glass mason jar. It's so visceral.
Do you want me to read it?
Well, it's up to you if you want to. Sure, go ahead and read it.
I'll read it so the audience can get an idea. A gull feather lands at the foot of the birch. 2 squirrels race up parchment skin. 1,000 birds sing coded songs from a single branch. The birch tells no one their secrets. My fingers trace the braille of the bark. A man taps his tambourine to metronome waves. Questions roast in the afternoon sunshine, and answers are jammed in a glass mason jar. I like this birch tree that was in my view at the place that I stood to write poetry and look at the lake. So every time I went, I was attracted to this one sort of peephole over the bluff, and it's framed by a birch tree. So I just kind of imagined for this poem what that birch tree might have observed or experienced being in that place. And I'll have to say the first version of the poem was very cheesy. You know, like, oh, he heard the secrets that lovers, you know, whispered to themselves. And, you know, it was very cheesy.
The poem a younger you would have written.
Yeah, but that's how, and that's something that I find is very important, which I imagine you would agree with, which is to write good poetry, you have to be willing to write bad poetry. So my drafts are just an idea. Oftentimes they don't come, they never, very rarely come fully formed. They're just an idea. So I think the idea, I was trying to capture what this birch might experience, trying to get away from, you know, watching the children play and hearing the secrets of the lovers.
I love that. Well, to hear more of beautiful reading of Catherine reading her own poetry, 4 o'clock, June 10th, Osmond Home. Be there. So I want to ask you a little bit about you, because I'm going to give you a chance to read more of your poetry on Saturday. How old were you when you started writing poetry?
I was in 4th grade. I told the children at Indian Trail the same story that there is an organization still in existence here in the Chicagoland area it's now called the Torrance Center for Creativity, the Midwest Torrance Center for Creativity, also known as the Center for Gifted. And this wonderful woman, Joan Franklin Smutney, who is a teacher at New Trier, an English teacher, started this program for enrichment for kids. And I was so fortunate that my parents drove me a very long way, maybe an hour each way, to a program when I was in 4th grade because I seemed to need some inspiration. I was getting a little checked out in 3rd grade. So they helped me do that, and I took a few classes, and one of them was Joan's creative writing class, and she taught me how to write free verse poetry, stories, but I really, really stuck with free verse poetry.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for answering my next question without even being asked. And you already mentioned Joan Franklin Smutney as being your inspiration. Who else are your inspiration? What do you consider an inspiration?
Well, literary inspiration, if you're asking that, from a poet standpoint, I love William Carlos Williams. I love all of his work. I just love his tradition that he was one of the first to start writing poetry about daily experiences, daily scenes that the common person could understand. Because one of the things that I feel is important about my poetry is I don't want it to be so obscure that people don't resonate with it. And a lot of poetry can get that way. It can get very heady and very intellectual. And I like the tradition of William Carlos Williams, where it's deep. There is depth to it, but you can connect with it in a variety of different ways. And I also like the Imagist, of which he is one. The Imagist tradition is to really form words so that your reader comes away with a very clear image. And I love reading images like William Carlos Williams.
Well, and to touch on that, that is one of the reasons why I think there has been such a buzz. Like everywhere I'm turning, I'm seeing your image, this book, whether it's bookstores or at off-campus writers' workshop, you got a lovely shout out for that because of the way we that live near the lake can relate. I mean, it's like you're speaking to each one of us individually. It's a beautiful thing. So
well, thank you. And what I'm realizing through this book is, I mean, I love the lake, but I'm realizing how much everybody really does love the lake. And I would love it if the lake could be the portal for those who maybe don't normally read poetry to read poetry, and to know that if you walk through the door and open this book, there will be something that grabs you.
Right.
I mean, the 2nd graders were grabbed. The 2nd graders could.
It would be a fresh look at the fresh
look.
water.
Exactly. Exactly. And you won't feel turned off. I think that is the idea.
It is a good launching space. So that's great. So do you leave little clues or secrets that family or friends would be able to locate in your poems? Like,
I'd say I do. Yes.
You don't have to say what they are.
No, I won't. I won't. But there are all people who know will know.
That's wonderful. That is great.
Easter eggs, right?
So how do your poems develop?
Well, as I said, have to be willing to write bad poetry to write good poetry. They usually start 95% of the time, unless I don't have a piece of paper, but pencil, notebook, chicken scratch. Just some kind of idea. Maybe it will be a really interesting line that I think of, or a really interesting image or something. But it starts with that. Usually it's very different from the final. And what I do is I write it, type it up. As I'm typing, I'm revising. Then I print it out. I might let it sit for a while, then go back to it and start marking up on the paper, go back, type it up. I mean, this could happen 20 times.
Sure.
But usually within that 20 times, I'm sharing it with friends. We've shared our poems together to
right.
get feedback. I'll share it with maybe a teacher or a professor that helps give me things to think about to make it better. And then I guess, once you publish it, they have to be done.
That is kind of an important deadline.
It is.
What is the best investment you ever made as a writer?
I'll say taking classes. First of all, the class we took at Lake Forest College, the Writing by the Lake class, taught by Joshua Corey, that was outstanding. I've also recently hired mentors. So this wonderful author, Susan Wooldridge, the author of Poem Crazy, I was crazy enough to just reach out to her and say, hey, your book inspired me many years ago. Do you happen to do one-on-one work? And she really didn't, but she kind of did.
Then let's look what you opened up for her.
Yeah, and she was excited about it. So that was hugely helpful because I needed kind of a new little spark for my poetry. So I think that and buying books.
That's great.
You can go to the library too, but sometimes they just don't have all the poems. You have to really hunt.
Through your work and through your writing, what are some common traps for aspiring writers?
I think that what you produce initially needs to be fully formed. I mean, it goes back to that process piece. I think in creativity circles and kind of design thinking circles, we call it prototype mode. And you really need to adopt the mentality that everything's an experiment and that you're not trying to reach perfection with the first draft that you write. It's always sort of like, I mean, just think of somebody who works with clay. Is the very first sort of squishing around they do with clay going to turn into a beautiful statue? Probably not. They have to work with it. And that's the same with writing. But I think, I think the trap is to think that perfection is going to come immediately. It's a process.
That's great advice. All right, well, we have a few more minutes, and I'm just going to ask you some real quick questions.
Okay.
What's the best day of the week for you to write?
Definitely a quiet day. Usually Mondays.
Okay. I will know not to text you or call you on Mondays. Time of day, morning?
It just all depends on the house and how I can quiet the house.
Okay. Do you write with music or in the silent room?
Silence.
2. What are your favorite bookstores?
Well, I love Lake Forest Bookstore. That's my local independent bookstore. And the bookstall in Winnetka is fabulous. Any independent bookstore, I love.
Totally agree. What are your favorite literary journals you like to read?
I love one called Humana Obscura. It's kind of more of a nature journal, and I found that kind of the tradition of eco-poetics is interesting to me. Some of the journals come and go, but that's one of them that right now is going strong and I really enjoy.
Wonderful. Name a favorite character in any book you've read.
Any book I've read. There is a series of children's books, young reader, they're about 5th grade, and they're written by a University of Chicago lab school teacher named Blue Ballier, and her characters are amazing. I can't remember all their names, but one is named Calder, and I love this kid, but those are fabulous books.
Wonderful. Well, it's good to know for my teaching practice.
Oh, and they bring in all sorts of things. It's so good.
What are you reading now?
Actually, right now, I'm reading a book on biomimicry, which is invention inspired by nature. And
wonderful.
How to look at nature to create innovations.
Excellent. I've learned so much from you today. Thank you. I'm going to have to listen to it to write down all the great resources. Thank you so much for this time today. In case you didn't hear me already, I just want to promote June 10th, 4 o'clock p.m. You can hear Catherine, and she will be our only featured poet that night, so she'll have full stage to share more of her poetry, more of her thinking. And please go to Highland Park Poetry Facebook. You can read more about her, and you can read this wonderful review about her book, which will entice you even more to join us on June 10th.
Thank you
Oh,
so
and
much.
Osmond Gallery is at 1898 Sheridan Road, right across the street from Norton's, if you need a food marker. Thank you so much. I so appreciate this time for all of us.
Well, thank you, Julie, and
Thank
thanks
you.
for your great questions.